My father was standing at the kitchen counter when I walked in, and I knew before he even turned around. He had my laptop open. My design portfolio. 3 years of work I'd built in secret, client emails, invoices, the website I'd quietly launched 6 months ago. All of it right there on the screen. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me the way he always did when I disappointed him, like I was a math problem he kept getting wrong. Sit down, Hazel. I didn't sit. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on, keys still in my hand, and I thought, this is it. This is the conversation. He'd always had a way of making rooms feel smaller. My father is an engineering director at one of the largest infrastructure firms in Calgary. He built bridges for a living, literal ones, and he approached everything, his marriage, his children, his dinner table, with the same load-bearing precision. Every decision had to hold weight, had to make structural sense. Anything that didn't fit his blueprint was, in his words, a liability. My older brother was the blueprint. Civil engineering at U of A, then a position at my father's firm. Clean, linear, load-bearing. I was the crack in the foundation. I'd done everything they'd asked for 22 years. Honor roll. University of Calgary. Business degree. A corporate job at a downtown consulting firm where I wore blazers and pretended I wasn't dying a little every single day. I was good at it. That was the worst part. I was actually good at it. That was the worst part. I was actually good at it. But at night, after work, I designed logos, brand identities, packaging. I started taking freelance projects in my second year of work, small ones at first, then bigger, then a referral from one client to another, until I had a quiet little business running out of my apartment bedroom, and then out of a small studio I rented on 17th Avenue, and my father had no idea any of it existed. He found out the way fathers always find out about the things they weren't supposed to know. My aunt mentioned it. She'd seen my work on a local restaurant's new menu and asked if that was me. My mother confirmed it without thinking, and my father had apparently spent 2 weeks sitting on that information, waiting. "You've been lying to us," he said. "Not a question. I haven't lied about anything. You've been running some hobby business behind our backs while pretending to have a real career. Do you understand how that looks? Your uncle works at that restaurant. He called me, Hazel. He called me." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to be upset about. Not that his daughter had built something, but that someone had called him about it. "It's not a hobby," I said. "I made more last year than I do at the firm." That was the wrong thing to say. I knew it the moment it came out. Not because it wasn't true, it was completely true, but because it reframed everything in language my father understood. And then he had to reconcile what that meant, and reconciling things that didn't fit his blueprint made him mean. "Then quit," he said. "Quit the firm, go do your little design thing, and don't come asking us for anything when it falls apart. You want to throw away a stable career for something that could disappear tomorrow? Fine, but you do it without this family's name behind you." My mother was sitting at the table. She didn't look up from her tea. "I'm not asking for anything," I said. "I never asked for anything. You're living in an apartment we co-signed for. You drive a car your grandfather left to this family. You come here for Sunday dinners and you sit at this table and you take and you take and you're doing it all while lying to our faces." He wasn't wrong about the apartment. He wasn't entirely wrong about the dinners, but the way he said take and take, like I was some kind of extraction, like my presence at Sunday dinner was a bill he'd been quietly running, that landed somewhere deep. "I think you should leave," he said. "Come back when you figured out what kind of person you want to be. I know exactly what kind of person I want to be. Then you know where the door is." I drove back to my apartment on a Tuesday night in November with the heat broken in my car and sleet coming down on Crowchild Trail, and I thought, very clearly and very calmly, okay then, I want to be honest about what the next few weeks were actually like, because it wasn't some montage of triumph. I cried in my car in a Safeway parking lot. I called my best friend Ren at 11 at night and just breathed on the phone for a while because I didn't have words yet. I ate cereal for dinner 4 days in a row. I went to work at the consulting firm and sat in meetings about Q3 deliverables and smiled at the right times while something fundamental had shifted in me. But I also, very quietly, made a decision. I gave notice at the firm 2 weeks later. 30 days. My manager looked at me like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. I moved out of the co-signed apartment by end of January. Rented a cheaper one in Inglewood, month to month. With a second bedroom, I immediately converted to a proper studio. I put up better lighting. I bought a real desk. I made a list of every client I had, every prospect, every relationship I'd built, and I worked it like it was the only thing I had. Because it was. My mother texted me twice in that period. Once to ask if I was eating, once to tell me my cousin's engagement party was in March, and she hoped I'd come. I replied to both. Briefly. I didn't bring up my father and she didn't either, and we both understood we were performing a kind of careful detente. My father didn't contact me at all. I won't pretend the business grew overnight. It didn't. There were months where I was watching my account carefully, shifting things around, taking on projects I wasn't excited about because the rent on my Inglewood studio was real money and stability meant saying yes sometimes when you'd rather say no. I learned a lot in those months about pricing, about contracts, about the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being every department of a company at the same time. But I also had something I hadn't had in years. I had the thing I was building actually be mine. Every client I'd landed myself. Every referral came from work I'd done. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in that. Not triumphant, not loud, just solid. The way a good structure feels when you test its weight and it holds. Around 18 months in, I got an email from a Vancouver-based consumer goods company. They found me through a packaging project I'd done for a Calgary skincare brand that had gotten some attention. They wanted a full rebrand, identity, packaging system, retail display design, the whole scope. It was the largest project I'd ever been offered by a factor of 3. I flew to Vancouver for the pitch on a Thursday in September. I presented in their Gastown boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbor, and I was genuinely not nervous. I don't know when that happened. The not being nervous. But somewhere in 18 months of doing this alone, I had learned to trust my own judgment in a room. They signed with me 2 weeks later. That project took 8 months. It paid more than I'd made in any full year at the consulting firm. It also got written up in a trade publication that covered Canadian retail branding, and then I got 3 more inquiries off that write-up. And then, this is the part that still feels slightly unreal. One of those inquiries was from a private equity group that had just acquired a portfolio of mid-market consumer brands and wanted a design partner on retainer for 2 years. I hired my first employee in the spring, an office manager who was better at the administrative side of the business than I would ever be. I moved out of the Inglewood studio into a proper space in the Beltline with room for a small team. I set up a corporate account. I talked to an accountant about structure, about incorporation, about what it meant to have a business that had crossed a threshold I hadn't consciously planned for but had arrived at anyway. I was 28 years old. The first time I spoke to my father after that night in the kitchen was at my grandmother's birthday party in June. My grandmother is 81 and has no patience for family conflict, so she'd simply invited everyone and made it clear she expected us all to show up, and that was that. My father and I stood near the buffet table for a moment that I suspect felt longer to him than it did to me. He looked the same. Older, maybe. Something in the jaw. "You look well," he said. "I am well," I said. We didn't talk about the business. We didn't talk about the consulting firm or the apartment or the night in November. We talked about my grandmother's garden, which had apparently had a very good summer for tomatoes. And then my brother came over and absorbed my father into a different conversation, and I went to find Ren, who'd come with me as moral support, and we ate cake on the back porch, and I felt, more than anything, a kind of lightness. Not forgiveness exactly, not closure. Just lightness. Like I'd put something down I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. My brother called me in August. We'd had a decent relationship growing up, before I became the problem and he became the solution. He's 4 years older, and we've been close as kids, less close as adults, operating in the same family system with different assigned roles. He'd always been careful with me. Not unkind, just careful. The way you're careful around something that might upset the load-bearing structure. He called on a Wednesday afternoon. I let it go to voicemail, listened to the message, which was warm, casual, asking how things were going, saying it had been too long. I called him back the next day. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing much. How his work was going. A trip he and his wife had taken to Portugal. Whether I'd been back to see our grandmother. It felt like circling, but I let it circle because I was curious where it would land. Then, Dad mentioned the business is doing well. There it was. "It's doing fine," I said. "He said you'd taken on some big clients. That's great, Hazel." "Really?" This is kind of awkward to bring up, and you can absolutely say no." He laughed a little. "My wife and I have been looking at some investment property in Cochrane. We found something we really love, but the financing is, the market's been rough. We were thinking of asking family before going to a second lender just to explore options. I let a beat of silence sit there. How much? I asked. 60,000. As a loan, obviously. We put together terms. It would all be formal. I thought about all the Sundays I'd sat at that table, the way my father had said take and take, like it was my defining characteristic. I thought about my brother's careful politeness all those years, the way he'd never once pushed back on how I was treated, never once said that's not fair when my father's blueprint left no room for me. I'm not in a position to do that, I said. Oh, yeah, of course, no pressure at all. It's not about the money, I said, which was only partially true. I just think it's not a good idea to mix family and lending, for anyone. He said he completely understood. He said we should get dinner sometime. I said, yes, sure, let's do that. And we both knew we wouldn't, not soon. And we hung up, and I sat for a moment in my office, in the Beltline, with the afternoon light coming through the windows. I felt clear. That's the best word for it. Not angry, not satisfied in some revenge fantasy way, just clear. My mother came to visit in October, drove up from the house in the southwest, texted from the parking lot of my building to say she was there, and I went down and met her, and we walked to a cafe on 17th and had lunch. She looked around at the neighborhood, at the cafe, at me in my work clothes on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could see her calibrating. She asked about my work. I told her briefly what was happening. The retainer, the team, the new space. She listened with the careful attention she always had, the kind that processes information without immediately evaluating it the way my father did. I'm proud of you, she said eventually. I didn't say anything. I know things weren't handled well. That night, I should have said more. You didn't say anything, I said, not harshly, just factually. I know we didn't resolve it over lunch. I don't think you can resolve something like that over one lunch, and I wasn't sure I needed to. What I needed was to say the true thing, which I had, and to hear what was true for her, which she'd said, and to understand that those two things could exist without everything being fixed. I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot. Longer than usual. She got in her car and I watched her drive away, and then I walked back to my office and answered emails. My father came eventually. Not with an apology. I don't think that's in his architecture. But with something adjacent. He asked me to meet him for coffee in November, exactly 2 years after the kitchen conversation. I almost didn't go. I told Ren I almost didn't go, and she said, "You'll regret it more if you don't," which is exactly what I needed to hear because it was true. We met at a Tim Hortons, because that's where my father always meets people when he's uncertain. There's something about the fluorescent lights and the unremarkable coffee that seems to make him feel on stable ground. He asked about the business, really asked. Not the way my brother had, circling toward something, but directly, with the technical curiosity he applied to things he was trying to understand structurally. How did I manage cash flow across projects with different timelines? Had I considered any financing arrangements to fund growth without equity dilution? What was my client concentration risk? I answered him, directly, the way I'd answer anyone who asked real questions. You built something solid, he said. He was looking at his coffee. I didn't think. I assumed it would be the other kind. The other kind? Unstable. A bet. It was a bet, I said. I just calculated the odds better than you thought I could. He didn't say he was sorry, but he looked up from his coffee and held my eyes for a moment, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not pride exactly. Something more honest than pride. Something like the recognition that he'd assessed the load incorrectly, and the structure had held without him. Your grandmother's birthday is in February, he said. She'd want you there. I'll be there, I said. And I meant it. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't. Not because he'd earned it back, because I'm not sure it works like that. But because I am not the sum of what he decided about me on a Tuesday night in November when the sleet was coming down and he thought the worst thing he could say was, "You know where the door is." I knew where the door is. I walked through it. And I built something real on the other side. That's mine. It will always be mine. And nobody's voice, not from a kitchen in Calgary, not from any room I've ever walked out of, gets to live in my head rent-free anymore. I still design. Every day, something. Not always for clients. Sometimes just for the feeling of it, the way you breathe differently when you're doing the thing you're actually made for. My studio in the Beltline has a window that faces west, In the late afternoon in winter, when the light comes through low and gold before it drops behind the Rockies, I sometimes stop and just watch it for a minute, not thinking about anything in particular. Just there. That's what I was trying to get to all along, I think. Not the clients, or the retainer, or the incorporation papers, though I'm grateful for all of it. Just this, a room that's mine, work that's mine, a life that was chosen instead of assigned. My father built bridges. I get it now. The appeal. The certainty that if you do the engineering right, the thing will hold. I just had to learn that the bridge he was building wasn't meant to take me anywhere I wanted to go. So I built my own. I've thought a lot about that Tuesday night on Crowchild Trail, the sleet on the windshield, the broken car heat, my hands at 10 and 2, driving back to an apartment that still had his name on the lease. I've thought about what it takes for a person to look at their own child and say you know where the door is and mean it as a punishment. What I understand now, that I didn't then, is that my father wasn't trying to destroy me. He was trying to protect the version of me he'd already decided was real. The one that fit his load calculations. The one that wouldn't introduce variables he hadn't engineered for. When I showed him the portfolio, the clients, the income, he didn't see evidence that I was capable. He saw evidence that he'd been wrong, and that was the thing he couldn't hold. That's not evil. It's just a very human kind of blindness, and it costs people more than they ever realize until the bill comes due. Because here's what I'd come to believe, not because anyone told me, but because I lived it. The choices we make about other people don't stay contained. My father's choice to dismiss what I was building didn't just affect me. It affected what he knows about me now. The distance that still exists between us at family dinners. The careful politeness that replaced what could have been something real. He paid a price for that night in the kitchen, not as punishment from some outside force, just as the natural consequence of a decision that closed a door he can't fully reopen. And my choice to walk through that door anyway, to not shrink back or come home asking to be let in again, that had consequences too. Good ones mostly, but real ones. There were months of genuine uncertainty. There were projects I took because I needed the money, not because I believed in them. There was a particular kind of loneliness in building something alone that I hadn't anticipated. But the thing about doing hard things by choice is that they build something in you that nothing else can. Not competence exactly. More like a kind of structural integrity. You learn that you can hold weight. Your own weight, first, then more. Ren told me once, in that early Inglewood period, that she thought I was the bravest person she knew. I told her that wasn't true, that I was just too stubborn to go back. She said those might be the same thing. I think she was right. What I want to say, to anyone watching this who recognizes something in Hazel's story, not the design business or the Calgary geography, but the feeling of being assessed as insufficient by someone who is supposed to be on your side, is this. The assessment is not the verdict. Someone else's inability to see what you're building is not proof that it isn't there. Do the work anyway. Build it quietly if you have to. Let the results be the argument you don't need to make out loud. My father came around partially. My mother came around more fully and faster. My brother is still circling. That's all okay. I'm not waiting on any of them to decide what's true about my life. I have a window that faces west. Late afternoon in winter, the light comes through gold before it drops behind the Rockies. That's mine. That took years of choosing it, again and again, over the easier path. Worth every single Tuesday night in the sleet.